So I'm an economics professor. I'm really interested in how this one author is challenging the economics of the book publishing industry. And there are two types of people who have clicked on this video, and I want to make sure that no matter which one you are, you're going to see that there's value in this video. So one type of person who clicked on this is an economics type person. Don't worry, you're like, we're in the same camp. And you're like, I don't know who this Brandon Sanderson guy is. Like, why do I care? It's super interesting, and I hope the economics are something that, I mean, if you've already clicked on this video, don't worry, you're going to be getting some value out of this. But then there's like the hardcore Brandon Sanderson fans, or the close to hardcore Brandon Sanderson fans, who are like, look, I'm on Creme Posting, I'm on 17th Shard, like, what in the world is this economics professor going to do to tell me something that I don't know already? And trust me, there's still value in this. Like, bing! Here's a graph that I did with data that I've collected from his crowdfunding campaigns and the books. I think it's an analysis that you're going to be interested in. So don't worry, there's value for you too. But I'm going to try to tell kind of a big picture story with some interludes in classic Brandon Sanderson fashion, and I hope that both sides get a lot of value out of this video. I know you already know who Brandon Sanderson is if you're that second viewer, but for the sake of the first viewer, give me just a short recap. Brandon Sanderson is one of the most prolific and popular authors in the world right now. And while he's been publishing regularly since 2005 was when Elantris came out, he has been just coming out with bigger and bigger works. And he really jumped into the mainstream, became more of like a household name with his Kickstarter back in, was that 2021 that he did, or was it 2022? Where he launched 4 books that he had written in secret and raised $41.7 million on Kickstarter, publishing these himself, right, through Kickstarter, and, you know, breaking the Kickstarter record, and not just by a little, like by a lot. So Brandon Sanderson became quite popular in that year, and now I want to talk about the ways in which he's challenging the economics of the book publishing industry. And really the story needs to start, I think the best place to start the story is how we know that the Department of Justice has been talking about Brandon Sanderson. I mean, like the actual Department of Justice in charge of the FBI, DEA, those guys, they're talking about Brandon Sanderson. So what's going on there? But to understand that, first we need to talk about how the biggest influence on what you read is almost completely invisible. So the first Brandon Sanderson book I read, and you know, the hardcore Brandon Sanderson fans are going to probably raise their eyebrows when they hear this, was Steelheart. My question is, what does Steelheart have in common with Atomic Habits, Read, Write, Own, and Odu, and Max and the Midnights? Thought I was going to have this really nice display right there. That did not quite work. All right. What do these 4 books have in common? I mean, at first glance, not that much. I mean, we've got 2 fiction books, 2 nonfiction books. This is technically a graphic novel. I mean, there's nothing visibly similar about them. But again, that's what I meant by there's an invisible force directing what you read. Now, as an economics professor, when I hear about invisible forces directing things, I naturally think of Adam Smith's invisible hand. This is the metaphor he gave for how the market works. There's a decentralized market where everyone is acting independently, though it's as if an invisible hand is directing resources on where they should go. But that's not exactly how the book market works, because for most books, you don't know how many people are going to want to read that book. So before you know whether there's any demand for it, you have to print a ton of copies, which means you have to incur a large fixed cost to get the book out into the hands of the people. Now, of course, you might hedge and just do a limited run at the beginning, see how it goes, and then expand. But like, to get that first run out there, that's going to be a pretty large fixed cost for something where you don't even know if there's any demand for those books. That means before the invisible hand can have its way in getting books to the people who want them, there's a very visible hand deciding whether a book is worth publishing in the first place. And that is the publisher's hand. But even though that publisher is visibly directing the work, most of that is invisible to us. Like, can you even name the publishers of these books? I mean, Steelheart is Delacorte Press. I had never heard of that before picking this up. Atomic Habits, Avery, haven't heard of that one. This one's Random House. I have heard of Random House. And this one says Crown Books for Young Readers. So there you go. I have at least heard of Random House. But actually, the whole thing is, all of these books are Random House. They're all Penguin Random House, actually, because these are all just different brands under the big umbrella of Penguin Random House. There's not that many publishers out there. There are only 5 major publishers in the English-speaking world, at least. Now, those 5 big publishers were recently about to turn into 4, and this is where Brandon Sanderson comes into play. So, Penguin Random House wanted to buy Simon & Schuster, I think is how you pronounce it. They wanted to merge the two companies and make a bigger publishing company. Now, mergers, especially from big companies, there's all these challenges on monopolies, and we're talking about these kind of things, especially now in America. But like monopolies and publishing, we already said this is an invisible thing. You usually don't care who your book publisher is. In fact, did you even notice back in 2013 when Penguin Random House came from Penguin Group and Random House Publishing or Group? I don't know what they are. I just know that they missed out on a great chance. Instead of being Penguin Random House, they could have been Random Penguin. And then if they got Simon & Schuster in there, they could have been Random Penguin Shoes. Like, the branding, they're just missing out on these opportunities, right? But like, did you notice anything in your reading consumption or anything with... I'm trying to even think of an example of some way your life would have been affected by the fact that those publishing houses combined into one. Why do we care that Simon & Schuster are going to combine into one? Well, you and I might not see who the publishers are and might not care who the publishers are, but there is a party that's really important in this transaction that cares about who the publisher is. Because publishers, again, they have to print these books. They're deciding whether these books are going to be published in the first place. And to get books into their house, they need authors. These publishing houses don't have in-house authors. They need to get authors who are basically freelance, right? And they will compete with each other to try and get contracts with different authors. I'm worried I'm going to knock these over. I should just put these down right now. And that's where, like, you'll have auctions for books or you'll have bids on books. Sometimes these make the news. Most of the times they don't, right? You get an agent who shops the book around, tries to get a bidding war going on. All that is competition among the different publishers. Now, the problem is, if you don't have that many publishers, it's pretty easy to start getting into things like collusion or less competition, where people say, hey, let's not compete with each other. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Like, it'd be a lot nicer if we weren't charging or we weren't paying these authors a ton of money for these books, not knowing what we're going to make on the other side. Let's all kind of agree to keep that down. And that happens. That happened in Silicon Valley with like Google and Apple and Facebook. And I don't know all the companies involved in there, but they did the same thing with their employees. So we get to this problem where if there aren't that many publishers, there might not be enough competition in the market. And so the Department of Justice, when Random House tried to acquire Simon & Schuster, came in and sued them and said, we don't think that this is going to fly in our antitrust law. And Random House and Simon & Schuster, and honestly, I can't follow all the details, but they came together and they were defending themselves, making the case for why this isn't that big of a deal. And in their argument, they cite Brandon Sanderson. And they say, look, because this is happening right after his Kickstarter. They're like, look, Brandon Sanderson just raised $41.7 million to publish his own books, just 4 books. There is competition, right? People can self-publish. If they decide they don't like our deals, they can go out and they can find other things. We are facing competitive pressure, and there's no way we're going to be able to collude. there's no point in this. We can do this without turning into some sort of antitrust, anti-competitive monopoly type situation. And this inspired Brandon to make this video.
Brandon Sanderson was able to write these in a cave during COVID.
But ultimately, the Department of Justice was not convinced that this was a good argument. It was reasoned that, Brandon Sanderson being able to do that is an exception. Most authors cannot do that. Most authors are not going to be able to make these big claims. They're going to have to accept whatever you give them. You can't say there's a lot of competition out there. We're not going to allow this to go through. So they blocked that happening. So there's an example. Did Brandon Sanderson change the economics of the industry that way? Actually, I guess the argument would be that he failed to change the economics. Or, I don't know, I guess what your judgment on that is. It's kind of interesting. He was cited as someone who was shifting the economics, but it wasn't a big enough impact for them to say, yeah, this is okay going forward. But there's another part to the story, which I don't think Brandon Sanderson has really highlighted or connected the dots on this. But before we get into there, we need to have an interlude, right? We need to talk about some cool stuff. And he has recently done another, I'm not going to say Kickstarter, crowdfunding. That's the general term. He crowdfunded another project on a different website this time, Backerkit. That's why I didn't want to say Kickstarter that time. And again, phenomenal. He was selling leather-bound books, so really nice leather-bound books, on bookshelves, smelling of mahogany and stuff, right? All that going on. I wasn't interested in getting the leather-bound book, but there was something else that caught my eye. But to understand what I'm talking about, you need to understand something behind what the Stormlight Archives is, right? It's this biggest epic series. And the best way to compare what I'm about to say is to think about Hogwarts, right? Hogwarts has 4 houses, and each house has a mascot. And there's kind of this way that you identify with different houses. Some people like Gryffindor, nobody likes Hufflepuff. Mega fans are associating themselves with different houses. In the Stormlight Archive, there is an analogous thing. There are 10 orders, and within each order, there's something called a spren. And you do not need to know what a spren is. Let's just call that the mascot for that order. As part of this crowdfunding campaign, one of the things that they were selling was a plush of this spren, of this mascot. And that caught my eye because that's just fun. Just a fun thing to have is a little plush. But the nice thing about Backerkit is that they tell you underneath each order how many people have purchased that item. Which means that I can look at how much of each of these is sold and compare it to the price. Now, they're all actually priced at the same. They were $40 per plush. But they had different amounts sold. It doesn't take an econ class for you to understand that if everything is the same price, but they're selling different amounts, that means there's more demand for some than there are for others. So I thought, hey, that'd be really interesting to dive into that and say, what goes behind the demand for these? And I did what I think is actually a pretty interesting little bit of research that I know no one else has done because no one else takes the time to do that stuff but nerdy economists like myself. So one thing that you could do is look at the other swag that was available for these orders, or in the Hogwarts terms, houses. Because they had these kits that had stickers and pins and stuff. I actually didn't really look that much into them because I wasn't interested in getting them. But you could choose your order, your house, and say, this is what I identify with. I'm a Gryffindor, so I'm going to get the Gryffindor swag. I'm a Ravenclaw, so I'm getting the Ravenclaw swag, right? I just wanted to see, do the houses or orders that people identify with match up with the plushes or the mascots that people were interested in getting. And so here's a scatter plot of the two with a line of best fit between them. And yeah, not surprising, there is a strong correlation between those that people identify with and the plushes they ended up getting. It's not a perfect correlation. I'm not expecting it to be. There's definitely some that overperform others. And so there's like this aspect of identifying with an order that's leading to the demand for that plush. But that, like, it's not a very satisfying answer, because the question is then, why do some people identify with certain orders than others? Now, one thing that Brandon did before this was to have a quiz and ask yourself, like, it was a whole bunch of questions, and according to your answers, it would sort you into the order that was most appropriate for you. And the questions were a little random. It wasn't as easy to get. I mean, there's 10 orders, so you're not going to be able to like game it as well. I think I tried to be honest. I ended up getting sorted into the Gryffindor of them, right? I say Gryffindor because Harry, the main character, is in Gryffindor. And in the Stormlight Archive, there's Kaladin, who's like really the main character. And he is sorted into the Windrunners, and that's ended up being the one that was the best fit for me, which I was kind of like, yeah, that's kind of basic, but whatever. So maybe there's like that personality thing that sorts you into it, or maybe there's just like the ones that people have fun with. Like, not everyone's a Gryffindor, but they kind of like being a Gryffindor. They like Gryffindor because that's where Harry, Ron, and Hermione are, and so that's where you want to be too. And so what is it that leads people to identify more with those and then get the plushes associated with them? So now I still need something to push that. And so there's a pretty clear hypothesis. And you can think about it, carrying on the Harry Potter analogy more. You can say, well, why do more people identify with Gryffindor? Well, the main characters are in Gryffindor, right? So that makes sense. But there's kind of like, there's some way that there's a focus on that house, and that's why people identify with it, or that's why people want it. So how do we measure how much focus there is on each of these orders? Because there's only been 4 books. There's 10 orders. You're not going to be able to focus on all of them. There's got to be some way to measure how that they are focusing on one more than another. So what I did was I went and I grabbed the books, and I went and looked for every reference to the spren, just by general name and the order, to see if that could predict which ones people identified with and which ones, which plushes were sold. Now, the nice thing is I did not have to go through and physically look through each of the book. I don't have any of the Stormlight Archive books in physical copies. I just have ebooks. And so just spent a couple of minutes on my Kindle searching for each order and the spren name. And then that's how I just found this, right? I'll put a little bit more detail in my newsletters. That way, if you're interested in understanding how I did this, it'll be right there. So that's in the description. This is the correlation between how much of the plushes were bought on the y-axis and how often those spren or their orders were mentioned across all the books. And what you see is a very strong positive relationship. In fact, 50% of the variation in sales can be explained by how much those orders and spren are mentioned in the book. In fact, each of the orders has had a character kind of as the main character. Think of it as like the Harry of Gryffindor and the Malfoy of Slytherin, right? But they each have their own book. And these are the ones with their own books. And you can see that they're all mentioned the most, well, except for one. And I'm sure the Stormlight Archive fans on here know which one that one is. But these other 3 are mentioned the most, and 2 of them are the top 2 selling plushes. I think this is pretty cool to see this. And it also has a really important implication for these sales. Like, I think that people are making a mistake right now. And if you were savvy, the crowdfunding campaign is closed, but I think you can still order some of these. I think a savvy person could come in and possibly make some money off of this, right? Because it's pretty easy to see that the ones that have been mentioned the most, the ones who've had their books are far over here. And so the demand for their plushes is really high. And you look over here in this corner, these orders haven't been mentioned as much. But we know, based on the books, that in future books, they will be mentioned more. And so those dots are going to shift to the right. And as they get talked about more, the demand for those spren should increase as well. And so right now, I think it's the Ash spread is the least popular spread. And that makes sense. There's not an Ash spread that people identify with. Once that book comes out, there's a chance that people are going to really want that spread, and yet only a few of them were sold or produced. And so if you bought an Ash spread right now, you could potentially flip it on the market in the future and then have that chance to make a lot of money off of that spread. Now, the big question is, how much in the future? Like, we know it's going to be like a 5 to 6 year wait after this one, just for the next book. And then, like, when is the Ash spread? I think that's supposed to be book 9, but I don't know for sure. So you'd have to hold on to it for a long time. But I do think it's interesting that we're kind of underinvesting in the ones that haven't been mentioned a lot lately, and possibly missing out on a lot of people who are going to be like, oh man, I wish I had gotten that spread. If I knew how cool this one was going to be, I would have gotten it back then. Okay, next part on how Brandon Sanderson is changing the industry, because even though the DOJ, the Department of Justice, was not convinced that Brandon Sanderson was a competitive enough force to actually shift things in the industry, the evidence since then has actually shown that they were wrong. Brandon Sanderson is a big force. Now, most of you who are Brandon Sanderson fans probably already know this story, but, bear with me now because I have some more stuff to tell you later. When Brandon Sanderson did that first Kickstarter crowdfunding campaign and raised nearly $42 million, one of the things he did during that was say he was not going to release the audiobooks for those new books on Audible. And he went into a pretty long discussion about how he was not happy with Amazon's policies with Audible, with how they were treating smaller authors. And he just felt like there were a lot of things that had gone wrong. One of the things that really stood out to me was that you'd buy an Audible subscription and you get one free audiobook each month. And it turns out that like Audible subscriptions have basically been the same price for the last 15 years or something. And that means that 15 years ago, when you bought an Audible credit and you got an ebook, you're paying the same price and you're still getting a free ebook, which means even though prices across the economy have gone up with inflation, prices for Audible books have not gone up. And so authors are losing out just in a pure inflation sense. They're losing money. Second, like there's a lot of bargaining power from Amazon where they're paying you a very small portion of that audiobook commission. And so you're not getting that much out of it either, right? So there's a lot of things that Amazon can do because they are like a market leader. They have most of the market power in audiobooks that they're going to say, yeah, you're just, what are you going to do? Go somewhere else? Like, we're the best place for you to have your books. And as a result, we're going to take a lot of the money from that. Brandon Sanderson said, look, I know that I can sell these books and I can get these audiobooks out there without Audible. So he chose some other competing services. I don't even know the names of them. And said, I'm going to publish my audiobooks with these services. That got Amazon's attention. When a big author comes in and says, like, I'm not going with you, that starts to scare them, because publishers and venture capitalists are very similar. In fact, what do venture capitalists and fantasy authors have in common? They both love unicorns. A unicorn is, that one that breaks from the pack and makes way more money than the rest of the people. This is called a power law. Venture capitalists invest in 100 firms. They put millions of dollars into each of them with the expectation that, let's say, 99 of them are going to fail. But as long as one of them becomes a billion-dollar company, a unicorn, that means that they have covered all their losses and made millions of dollars in profit off of investing in that one firm. So you're going to have this, not putting all your eggs in one basket, you're going to diversify, do all of those things, right? And so Brandon Sanderson is the unicorn for these publishers. And when you look at like one author, Brandon Sanderson, making $41.7 million on his own, selling like books where he didn't even tell people the titles, right? He was just pure brand value. And you see somebody with that kind of power who says, you know what? Why do I even go to you guys to publish my books? I'm going to go publish on my own. I'm going to capture more of that money for me. That's one of your unicorns, right? You're out of those 100 books, you're losing that one that makes all the money. And so you only have the losses left. This is called adverse selection, or another thing is like the market for lemons, where essentially you're going to go and try and buy books, but the deals that you offer are only attractive to the people who don't have very good books. The people who have good books, like a Brandon Sanderson, say like, I can get a better deal somewhere else. They leave the market. And so you only have lemons left, which means the publisher is almost guaranteed to fail. So Amazon sees this and says, man, if our unicorns are going to be leaving the platform and they're going to go to our competition, that's going to make it really hard for this to be a functional program, because we make most of our money off the fact that people are coming, like, you can only get the Brandon Sanderson books here. And then they go and say like, well, since I already have an account, I'll go grab a few other books. If they can't get their marquee books here, they're not going to want these other books either. So Amazon came to Brandon Sanderson and said, look, we heard you. Let's talk. What do we need to do to keep you satisfied? And we don't know the full details of the discussion. I imagine one of the things was them being like, all right, we get it. You want more money for your books. Here's what we can offer you. Brandon Sanderson said, no, I do not want more money for my books. Well, I do want more money for my books, but this isn't pay me more money and I'll stop bringing up this issue. This was, I want everybody to have better options. I have the power to try and make some good deals for all authors. So he pushed back, and we don't have the details of the deal yet, but Brandon Sanderson announced that Amazon was piloting some things and they'd come to an agreement such that he was happy with them and he was going to start publishing his books on Audible again. And so in that way, like, Brandon Sanderson is very much changing the economics of the publishing industry, because he has reached a point where he has enough bargaining power to come in and get better deals for authors. And he is providing some of that competitive pressure that Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster said that Brandon Sanderson could do. Now, most authors can't do that. So I think the DOJ was right to say like, yeah, don't listen about Brandon Sanderson. But in a sense, they were wrong, because Brandon Sanderson is coming in and saying, yes, I'm going to use that power. I'm going to use my outside options to actually be a force for change. Let's do another interlude. This is a fun one, going back to the most recent crowdfunding campaign. So he was selling leather-bound books, which I've already mentioned. And with that, he had the swag. I mentioned the swag a little too. And so if you were a big spender, you come in for $250, you could get this leather-bound book plus some swag. About 8,600 people said like, yep, that's what I want. But obviously not everybody wants the swag. So some people bought this other item, which was just the leather-bound book, no swag. The swag itself was selling for like $50 each. It was $100 worth of swag on that one. And so you're like, yeah, I don't want that swag. And yet they priced it at the same, $250. And the thing that's wild to me is that you have people spending $250 for the leather-bound book with no swag, when they could get the exact same thing with swag, same price, like all benefits, right? As long as you're getting 1 cent of value from that swag, it's worth going for that other thing. Like, why don't you get that? Or like, the other weird thing is, why would Brandon Sanderson and Dragonsteel offer this option without the swag and keep the price the same, right? It's $100 less of merchandise. Give them at least a little bit of a discount. I think a couple of things happened here. Like, one, Dragonsteel looked at the big ticket item, that book, and they said, look, these people are already buying a big ticket $250 item. Like, the least we can do is give them some of the swag and not say like, oh, by the way, you're going to have to pay a little bit more if you want that other stuff. They're trying to like be loyal to those fans. At the same time, they're probably thinking, well, even though this is enticing, there will be some fans who are like, well, you know, do I really want that leather-bound book? And maybe adding on this swag is going to be enough to push them over the fence and say like, yep, yeah, I definitely want it. I'm getting all that value for just $250. That's a great deal. So I can see why they would want to give that swag to somebody. Fine. But why offer this other option where there's no swag and it's $250? And I think the answer is a pickle. So I don't like pickles. My wife thinks I'm crazy. She loves pickles. She's tried to get me to have pickles before. In fact, she gave me something recently that had pickles in it without telling me, just to see if I could like identify that there were pickles in it. And I could, but I'll admit that it was better than I thought it would be. But I don't like pickles. And so when I order cheeseburgers and they have pickles on them, I ask, no pickles, please, right? And my burger isn't any cheaper for removing the pickle. I pay the same price as the people who get pickles, right? There are things that come with the burger that don't affect the price. It's the people who get them without that stuff that kind of like subsidize the burgers for the other people. I think that's the same thing that's going on here, where they offered the original package and said, look, we'll give you the book plus a pickle. And we know that there are some people who aren't pickle guys. So we'll give you the option to not have the pickle, okay? Like you have no purpose for getting the swag. You're just going to throw it away. Fine. We'll give it to you without the pickle, but it's going to be the same price. This actually gets into the final point of this video, and that is where I think Brandon Sanderson most wants to change the economics of the publishing industry. Last year, there was a profile on Brandon Sanderson. No, not that one for you hardcore Brandon Sanderson fans. There was another one that came out like a week later and was a good one. There was a quote in there that stood out to me. In some ways, Sanderson thinks the video game industry is light years ahead of book publishing. They let you self-select your price point by getting these really cool items, he says. Elden Ring, for instance, retailed for around $60, but consumers could spend a little more for a deluxe edition with a digital art book and a digital soundtrack, or 4 times as much for a collector's edition with a 9-inch statue of Malenia. I don't know how to say that last name. I'm sorry. Kind of like what I started off my first interlude with on like how there's different demand for these characters. Like there are different levels of Brandon Sanderson fans. I enjoy Brandon Sanderson a lot. I read his books. I watch his YouTube channel every week. I think his stuff is great. Also, I only have ebooks. Like this actually isn't even my book. This is my son's book. I don't have physical copies of basically any of his books. I do have Elantris up here somewhere. I don't even think you can see it in there. So I have 2 physical copies of his books in my whole house. I just am fine reading the ebooks. And when I did this Backerkit campaign, I only got the ebook of his secret project. At least, well, I did get a plush, Stormfather. But I'm not someone who's going to go out there and spend hundreds of dollars on a leatherbound or spend thousands of dollars to try and fly to his convention, which I wouldn't have to fly. I'm in Utah, so I can just go to his convention if I want to. But I'm not spending hundreds or thousands of dollars on Brandon Sanderson merch or experiences. I guess I'm just a casual fan, right? But there are hardcore fans. If you're watching this video, you're a Brandon Sanderson fan and you've made it this long, you might be a hardcore fan. And what that means is we each have different willingness to pay for Brandon Sanderson's stuff. I'm willing to pay $10 for a book, and you might be willing to pay $250 to get a leather bound of that book. And if that's the case, if he's selling all the books at $10, sure, he sells a higher quantity, but there's a lot of value being left on the table. What he really wants to be able to do is charge you how much you're willing to spend for his book and charge me how much I'm willing to spend for my book. But you can't do that because if I get the book for $10 and you buy the same book for $250, what I would just do is buy the book for $10 and say, hey, do you want to buy the book from me for $100? And I can just undercut his prices. So to sell the same thing to everybody at the same competitive price, he's going to lose a lot of value. But if you can design packages that have a book plus a little bit of swag, plus an experience, an autograph, or something like that. Now, all of a sudden, you can find the people who want to spend the most on these things, who value these things the most. And he's not trying to exploit these people. He's trying to provide real value. This is a win-win for people. Like, I get books cheaper because I'm willing to just buy the book and read it. And other fans get like cool experiences and cool merch because they're willing to pay for it. And he provides that stuff. He wants the publishing industry to realize that there are super fans out there who are willing to spend a lot of money on this stuff. This is called price discrimination. Being able to charge different people different prices. And he's doing it through offering different packages. And he thinks the publishing industry needs to be doing more of this. And that makes sense for big authors. It's going to be harder for the smaller authors, but for big authors, they could be generating so much more revenue for these authors and rewarding them so much more if publishers were willing to go and do these kind of things. But publishers have pushed back against them. Like, he tells the story on creating the first leatherbounds where the publisher was like, man, like, you think people are going to want to buy a nice leatherbound copy of your book? Like, go for it. Like, you take on that risk. A lot of these companies don't think that this is a viable model. And Brandon Sanderson is out there showing, like, yes, we can make this a viable model. We can support authors. And, this is himself and his company. And that allows him to make more valuable content and more valuable stuff. It's all like this positive sum game. And that funny little, like, leatherbound with swag, leatherbound without swag, that just proves the point. There are some people who have such a high preference for Brandon Sanderson material, but certain things and not others, that they're willing to spend $250 and not even get the extra stuff that comes along. They just want the leatherbound, right? This is how you maximize value for the writers, and publishers might finally start listening, and we might see more of this going forward.